We have a very provocative guest, but a very brilliant man. David Goldberger is a free speech lawyer. He is associated with FIRE, which is the the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, which we had their head, Greg Lukianoff, on the show yesterday. He was with the ACLU and is a professor emeritus of law at Ohio State University. So not some kind of radical progressive leftist here. In the 70s, Mr. Goldberger defended the right of neo-Nazis in Skokie, Illinois, very famously, to protest and to have that ability to express their horrible views. Why? Because free speech is important, and the content of the speech should not necessarily dictate how laws respond to it. So do we criminalize these forms of anti-Semitism is the question today. And I'm throwing that out there with this conversation with this very interesting man. Here is David Goldberger.
David Goldberger, it's a pleasure to speak with you today.
Pleasure to speak to you.
I wanted to use your own words to try to introduce why you are such an interesting historical figure in the United States and in these broader discussions about free speech. So I'm going to read your words, recapping the Skokie case. You write, about 50 years ago, I led a team of dedicated lawyers from the ACLU of Illinois in representing a group of Chicago area Nazis who sought to hold a demonstration in downtown Skokie, Illinois. The Nazis' decision to go to Skokie provoked a storm of outrage because Skokie was a village that was nearly half Jewish and home to hundreds of Holocaust survivors. Skokie officials, you write, and their allies tried every possible legal device to block the demonstration, and their efforts triggered a barrage of lawsuits that quickly became known as the Skokie case. First, why did you do this, Mr. Goldberger? Why did you feel that these people needed to have their free speech rights defended?
Well, at least under the First Amendment, as opposed to free speech rights in other countries around the world, the theory is that every viewpoint is entitled to its day in the sun, so people can decide for themselves as to whether they disagree, what its merits are, and so forth. And there was no one else that would take up the cause for this group. And frankly, I personally felt if you could shut them down, you could shut anybody down. And therefore, the ACLU decided to represent them.
Where is the line for you personally in terms of where you think the law ought to be? Is it, we often talk about the analogy of shouting fire in a crowded theater or direct incitements to violence, but where do you draw the line?
Well, line drawing tracks the current standard for the First Amendment, and that is that there's an advocacy of law violation. It is inciting and intended to incite that law violation under circumstances in which the law violation is likely to occur. That can be prohibited because the speech then becomes integrated with the unlawful conduct itself. Other than that, it should be left alone. It's not the government's business simply because the government can't be trusted. If it can shut down the Nazis, it can shut down anyone.
Interesting. So if I'm to recap this, what you believe the standard should be, and perhaps in Canada as well, the speech has to be linked to another crime. So it could be arson or beating someone up. That's where we should draw the line.
Well, it should be incitement to commit that crime, or in the words of Justice Douglas, speech brigaded with action.
David Goldberger joins us, former ACLU lawyer who represented neo-Nazis 50 years ago in Illinois as a Jewish man. And this argument is difficult to make for fellow Jews, right? I mean, I myself am considered something of a contrarian in the local Jewish scene. How do you make this argument to fellow members of the tribe?
Well, my view is that it was, first of all, I make the argument in the terms that I've just made them to you, and that is that it's really government that has to be cabined, and that you have to have very clear limits on how much censorship the government can engage in. But then there's another dimension to it, and that is when I was representing the Nazis in the 70s, I went from synagogue to synagogue to explain my position. And one of my appearances, a Holocaust survivor stood up during the questioning period in the back of the room and said, in a very thick German accent, "I agree with Mr. Goldberger because I want to know who my enemies are." And I think that by suppressing speech, what you do is you drive bad guys underground, and that's not where you want them.
I agree. And in terms of speaking to the community here, one of my points as someone who has an online business and, is very into, I guess, the way that the tech is shaping our conversations, I actually think that these kind of laws make us less safe as Jews. It attracts a lot of negative attention online. The the reward systems online are inverse from what they are in real life meritocracies. So in that sense, attracting too much attention might actually put us in danger, don't you think?
Well, from my point of view, it turns the folks that I comfortably call bad guys into martyrs. And that, I think, is a danger to the Jewish community. It's a danger to the community at large because that garners them sympathy. And that's the last thing you want to be doing. Now, I want to distinguish advocacy of hateful thoughts and viewpoints from outright lying, and that is libel and the like. And that is a very serious problem online because of the problem of anonymity. It's very difficult to identify people who are libeling other people. And frankly, the problem hasn't entirely been solved online, the problem of lying, even when it's not classic libel. So long as they don't have the power to shut it down, I think the better way to deal with lying is a vigorous response to the lie. The difficulty is right now in the States, as you know, we have right-wing leadership that, frankly, is addicted to lying, and because of its status, the lies are accepted as truth. And I'm talking about the election deniers in this country, and the insults that go along with it. But I still think that the way we're handling it is preferable to having the government intervene, because to the extent, for example, if Donald Trump is our next president, not a prospect that I personally would like to see, just think of the censorship he will engage in if the courts let him. If he is elected, and as my mother would say, God forbid, think of the censorship he would engage in. He knows no boundaries. And to the extent that the courts allow the government to censor, he would become the government, and his powers to censor, if the standards were low, his power to censor would be huge. And so that the ability to censor is dangerous from either side of the political spectrum.
Part 2 with David Goldberger on the way, and your text to 514-800 as well. I'll take text and calls after the 11:30 news on this, because I know it's a big argument, it's a heavy argument, and I want to leave the space for you, especially members of the Jewish community, to react to it. So we'll get there. David Goldberger, Part 2 is on the way. Good morning, Happy New Year. Dan Delmar in for Elias. He is back on Thursday. We're continuing an admittedly somewhat uncomfortable conversation about how to respond to rising anti-Semitism in Canada with a very interesting and, I guess, a historical figure, really, in the U.S. David Goldberger was a former ACLU lawyer, and he's currently a professor emeritus of law at Ohio State University. In the 70s, he represented neo-Nazis in the famous Skokie, Illinois case because he defended their right to march in that town. Such was his commitment to free speech. Why am I bringing this up now? Because a lot of people aren't aware that, certainly in the Jewish community, that the Liberal government included in a budget bill, weirdly enough, in 2022, a criminal code amendment that bans the, quote, willful promotion of anti-Semitism by condoning, denying, or downplaying the Holocaust. Again, obviously, as a grandchild of survivors, this speech is reprehensible and should not be broadcast and is not appropriate for civil society. But should it be criminal is the question. And in Germany, a lot of members of the community are surprised when I tell them that we've actually followed the lead of the German government in overreacting to anti-Semitism and clamping down on free speech. The slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," again, as offensive as that might be, is now a form of incitement to hate and subject to criminal penalties in Berlin. So is that the way to go? Is that actually going to make us safer as a community? I would argue not. And David Goldberger argues the same. Here is part two.
David Goldberger joins us. He is a former ACLU lawyer who in 1977 was the head of the famous Skokie case. And he writes on the ACLU website that he once received a call from a Nazi leader complaining that his planned demonstration had been blocked by local officials there. The ensuing legal battle and controversy around it would test the organization's commitment to the First Amendment. And Mr. Goldberger, I wanted to get your perspective on a Canadian law that is causing maybe not a lot of discussion, I would say, but this story here from the Canadian press outlines how we're following the lead of France and Germany in some of our speech laws related to anti-Semitism. Canadian Jewish organizations calling on the Liberal government to remove what they see as barriers enforcing a relatively new criminal code provision against Holocaust denialism amid a rise in anti-Semitism. The Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs has been asking the Liberals to criminalize Holocaust denial, noting similar laws are in France and Germany. They say this would be an important symbolic step for the government to take to show that Canada says, quote, "This is the red line." And the report continues. The Liberal government amended the criminal code in 2022 in a budget bill to prohibit communicating any statement that, quote, willfully promotes anti-Semitism by condoning, denying, or downplaying the Holocaust, except in private conversations. So that's how our legal system changed, Mr. Goldberger. It has not been tested yet. When it is tested, what do you think happens then?
I can't speak for the Canadian courts, and I'm not familiar enough with Canadian jurisprudence to comfortably predict the outcome of a challenge to these kinds of laws. But I do recall that there was a case called Regina versus Keegstra, in which a school teacher who advocated anti-Nazi, pro-Nazi views in the classroom was jailed. And we also know that a so-called historian in Europe, I think he was a British historian, I want to say John Irving or David Irving, we can clear that up later, but wrote a book denying that the Holocaust ever occurred, and he was sentenced to 2 years in jail. His sentence was commuted to 1 year in jail after he'd served that year. I don't think we should be throwing people in jail for saying things like that. Everyone knows who those people are and rejects their views. I'm perfectly comfortable in letting public discourse handle it rather than the law courts.
The next step is now indigenous groups are saying, well, why isn't residential school denialism also in the criminal code? And to which I would say that's a completely fair statement, given that we as Jews advocated to put anti-Semitism and only anti-Semitism in the criminal code. It seems to me that it's completely fair that other groups ask for the same treatment.
Well, that gets into the point that I was making, that if Trump is elected in this country, Katie barred the door insofar as there will be expanded efforts to censor people who he disagrees with or who criticizes him. And with regard to the indigenous groups that are calling for an expansion of Canadian laws to protect them. One of the important considerations is that in Weimar Germany, there were hate speech laws and laws against advocating anti-Semitism and the like. And as you know, Weimar Germany did not survive Hitler, and we know where that went. So the laws really, they may make people feel good if they're on the books, and some people feel good if they're on the books. But what they are is expansions of government power, and expansions of government power where communications are concerned is rarely a constructive thing in a democracy.
I'm really relieved you brought up the Weimar Republic example, and I'd invite you to dig in to more of that a little bit. But suffice to say, I mean, there are precise examples of people like Goebbels being censored under the Weimar Republic, and then going underground for a while, and then, of course, achieving great power later on. So there are pretty direct examples of why censoring Nazis can actually make us less safe.
And that's something I've never doubted. And I must say that even with the horrible experience we had with the white nationalists in Charlottesville, they emerged in a demonstration in Charlottesville several years ago. And people say, well, they shouldn't have been allowed to do it. But the fact of the matter is that they were exposed to sunlight, and they have never really been much of a political force, except insofar as they tried to engage in violent activity on January 6th to try to prevent President Biden from being recognized as president. And that's not the kind of fear that we should have.
When you look back on your career, is this one of your greatest accomplishments, the Skokie case? How would you you put it in terms of the importance of your entire body of work?
I'm uncomfortable with the question, to be honest. My view is that the Skokie case was a teaching moment. It never really was decided by the United States Supreme Court. I think it helped illustrate the importance of the First Amendment and the boundaries of censorship, boundaries on censorship that the First Amendment establishes. And to that extent, I'm quite pleased with it. But to compare it to other things that I've done, I have to let the people who know me judge that, because a lot of people still don't like it.
No regrets on your end, I assume.
No. If I'm a little old for it now, and I've hung up my spurs, but if necessary, I wouldn't hesitate to go back into that cauldron, because if other people were unwilling to do so.
The value of the contrarian in a society. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my view is that contrarians are indispensable in a democracy, because they're the ones that bring in new ideas and fresh perspectives, and are willing to stand on principle often when others are not. The important thing is that the contrarians learn to communicate their contrary views in a way that is instructive and not offensive. I mean, there are some contrarians, as we both know, that cannot resist kind of poking the tiger and love to poke the tiger. The idea isn't to poke the tiger for the fun of it. The idea is to help people understand what's important in a democracy.
I think you've perfectly encapsulated what should be a personal goal of mine. Thank you for this conversation, sir. It's been a real honor.
Pleasure to talk to you.
Take care, and all the best for the holiday season.
Same to you.
There you go. David Goldberger, former ACLU lawyer and professor emeritus of law at Ohio State University, really a historical figure in the U.S., and not every day you get to talk to someone who's made history in the U.S., but it is obviously a very sensitive issue, and I can appreciate that. And I know that members of my community, Jews, are comfortable with talking about free speech and comfortable with political discussions.